imagine for a second waking up tomorrow and just discovering that the police, the banks, the courts, I mean, the entire government has just completely vanished overnight.
Right. Yeah, just gone.
Like the power grid is dead, the supermarkets are totally empty, and you have to wonder what keeps you from turning on your neighbor? Like what actually holds human beings together when the structures that we rely on every single day just completely evaporate?
It's really the ultimate psychological stress test for a society.
Mm-hmm.
We spend so much time, analyzing geopolitical conflicts through this lens of like troop movements and political treaties and borders.
Yeah.
But we rarely look at the hidden underlying behavioral forces that sort of take over when absolute worst case scenarios become your everyday reality.
Right, which is exactly why we're doing this today. So, okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are looking at a deeply unsettling but honestly fascinating presentation from the year 2026. The deck is titled Sudan, a fragmented spiral. And we are taking these 15 pretty dense slides and using them to really understand the conflict, the societal collapse, and also the sheer resilience of the Sudanese people. But we aren't just reading a history book here.
Yeah.
We are diagnosing this through a very specific socio-psychological framework.
Yeah, because treating a collapsing nation like it's just a broken machine that just needs its old parts reassembled is, well, it's a flawed approach.
Right.
When a society undergoes the kind of extreme trauma that we've seen in Sudan since the fighting exploded in April 2023 between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, human psychology fundamentally alters. Like it changes at its core.
And the sources we have, they lay out that alteration in really stark visual terms right from the jump. So slide 1 shows an illustration of a map of Sudan, and it has these sharp colored geometric shapes just projecting outward from the capital, Khartoum. And they're splintering out into regions like Darfur and Kordofan. And right next to this fractured map, the source poses the central, really heavy question of this whole deep dive, which is, what value systems sustain a society when its institutions collapse?
Which is such a profound question because when the centralized state disappears, people don't just sit around waiting for a new government to form.
Right, they can't.
Exactly, they can't. They instantly adapt. They regress to older, much deeper systems of survival.
And the numbers detailing that collapse are just, they're staggering. And they really set the stakes for everything we are about to discuss today.
Yeah, they do.
So slide 2 shows an illustration, and it details that same map we just talked about, but now it's covered in these heavy displacement arrows pushing outward.
Pushing into all of the neighboring countries?
Yeah, exactly. Into Chad, Egypt, South Sudan, Ethiopia. We are looking at a 2026 reality where 11.6 million people are internally and externally displaced, and that's according to the World Bank.
It's just a massive scale of human movement.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it goes on. 21.2 million are facing severe food insecurity. The economy has suffered this massive 43.4% cumulative GDP contraction.
Wow.
And the extreme poverty rate is projected to hit 59%. That's more than half the country in extreme poverty.
Right. And so to comprehend how a nation reaches those catastrophic metrics and really why standard international interventions have completely failed to stop it, this presentation introduces a diagnostic tool called spiral dynamics.
Okay, wait, I have to push back a little on this right away. Because we are talking about a brutal, devastating war with literally millions of people starving.
Right.
And we are going to diagnose it using color-coded behavioral rings.
I know, it sounds a bit...
Isn't a socio-psychological model a little too academic, maybe even a little disconnected from the blood and dirt of what's actually happening on the ground?
I completely get that reaction. It sounds totally abstract until you see how it explains the exact motivations of the people holding the weapons.
Okay.
Spiral dynamics isn't about, group therapy or something. It's a heuristic model. It maps out how human value systems evolve in response to their physical environment. So when the environment becomes a literal war zone, the model shows us exactly why people abandon democratic ideals and pick up rifles.
All right, I'm with you. Let's look at the mechanics of it then.
Okay.
Slide 3 shows an illustration detailing a flow chart that moves from left to right. It starts with life conditions, which then activates activated values, leading to behavioral models, and finally ending in institutional reality.
Right. And the slide establishes 3 core rules for this tool that are just crucial to keep in mind for the rest of this deep dive.
Okay, what are they?
First is simultaneity. This means different value systems, different levels of this spiral are operating within Sudan at the exact same time.
Okay.
Second is no moral labels. The colors we are about to discuss, they don't represent good or bad people. They
Hmm.
represent highly adaptive survival systems.
I see.
And third, and this is probably the most important, is regression. Extreme war forces people to abandon higher-level, complex thinking and reactivate primitive evolutionary survival instincts.
Okay, so is this basically like Maslow's hierarchy of needs? But instead of charting the psychology of one single person, it's a framework for an entire society fracturing under stress.
Yes, that is a highly accurate way to frame it.
Oh, cool.
If an individual is starving, they aren't worried about self-actualization or, learning to play the piano.
Right, they just want food.
Exactly. And similarly, a society facing artillery fire isn't going to prioritize international trade agreements or voting rights. They regress down the spiral to whatever level keeps them alive right now.
And the presentation maps these levels out visually for us. Slide 4 shows an illustration noting these atomic-like intersecting rings hovering over a map of Sudan. It almost looks like a really complex molecule or something.
Yeah.
And on the left, we have the key to the 8-colored strata represented by those rings.
Right, so these colors range from the most basic, which is beige. That's purely physical survival.
Okay.
Then moving up through purple for kinship, red for warlordism, blue for state order, orange for urban commerce, green for civic solidarity, yellow for systems thinking, and finally turquoise, which represents ecosystem integration.
Wow. Okay, so there's a lot of levels.
That are. And the tragedy of the Sudan crisis is essentially a violent, simultaneous clash between all these different colored value systems.
So let's start at the absolute bottom of that spiral, because based on those numbers earlier, that is where millions of Sudanese people have been forcefully pushed.
Yes, unfortunately.
Slide 5 shows an illustration describing a large circle that is fracturing and breaking apart at the outer edges. And that broken outer shell represents the state dissolving. And inside that circle, you have these heavy arrows pointing inward toward deeply protected center layers that are labeled family, clan, and tribe.
And that inward motion that visually represents the psychological and social regression we just talked about.
The regression rule, right.
Exactly. When the outer layer, meaning the state, fails to provide security, people retreat inward to the beige and purple levels.
Okay.
Beige is pure, raw survival. By 2026, the presentation notes that 34 million people require humanitarian aid just to secure basic food, water, and shelter. At the beige level, there is no 5-year plan. There's literally only making it to tomorrow morning.
Right. And right above that raw survival instinct is purple, which the slide defines as kinship and belonging. So family, tribe, and local Sufi religious networks become the sole providers of safety. But look, I have a question here. If the centralized state is totally gone and these local Sufi networks and tribal clans are the only ones stepping up to feed people and protect them, isn't that community resilience?
It is.
So why is that framed as a vulnerability in the slide?
Well, it is resilience, absolutely, but it comes with a really dangerous trade-off. The presentation calls this the paradox of the purple level. Yes, kinship networks save lives, and they prevent total social collapse. But because your safety is now exclusively tied to your specific ethnic or religious in-group, it drastically deepens polarization.
Oh, I see.
You only trust your own. And in a resource-scarce environment, that mindset inevitably fuels cycles of revenge and communal violence against anyone who is perceived as the other.
Because, I mean, if the other gets the water or the grain, your family dies. It just becomes this brutal zero-sum game.
Precisely. And when kinship isn't enough to secure those basic resources, you have to ask, what fills the power vacuum?
Brute force.
Brute force.
Which brings in the violence of the next level up. Slide 6 shows an illustration depicting a thick, red, cyclical diagram. And it has these arrows where control of weapons leads to territorial conquest, which then leads to resource extraction, like taking over gold mines and taxing citizens. And that feeds into enhanced military capacity, and that just cycles right back into controlling more weapons. It's a closed, endless loop of extraction.
This is the red level. The core logic here is very simple. Power belongs to the armed. This is the driving psychology behind the SAF command, the RSF, allied militias, and regional defense forces.
Okay, so this is where the warlords operate.
Exactly. Red is characterized by warlord prestige, personal loyalty to a commander, and violent extraction. The source actually explicitly cites Human Rights Watch data here to neutrally document the reality on the ground.
Right, which we want to be clear, we are just reporting what the presentation and the sources are laying out.
Yes, exactly. And what they document is that political conflict evolves into a raw fight for gold routes, border crossings, and agricultural hubs. The tactics used by these armed factions include extralegal killings, sexual violence, and systemic plunder.
It's just horrific. But here is what I find so deeply, I don't know, manipulative about this whole conflict. These armed groups, they rarely go on camera and admit that they are just acting as warlords.
No, no.
They always claim they are committing these acts for the good of the country. And that brings in the next color in the model. Slide 7 shows an illustration ascribing a massive blue stone pillar completely shattering, just breaking apart. Huge chunks labeled Army Order, Religious Norms, Tribal Order, and the Law are breaking away and falling to pieces.
That shattering pillar is the blue level, which the deck defines as the fractured demand for discipline. Blue represents the deep-seated societal desire for a centralized state, religious normativity, and national unity.
People want order.
They want order. But here we encounter the blue paradox. Every armed faction in this conflict justifies its violence through blue lens.
Oh.
They tell the international community they are fighting to defend the legitimate state or the national interest against chaos. Yet their violently enforced definitions of order systematically dismantle the very shared legal institutions they claim to be protecting.
Which creates a truly toxic hybrid system, honestly. Slide 8 shows an illustration detailing a triangle that connects the SIF, the RSF, and regional movements. And all 3 points of this triangle, they converge on a center circle labeled force plus territory plus claim to legitimacy. And next to it is a table showing the red-blue nexus. Let me just read a bit of this table because it's wild. It connects red actions like weapon control to blue disguises like claims to legality.
Yep.
So essentially, they are taking raw warlord violence, like shooting up a rival faction just to take over a gold mine, and they are putting a crisp blue suit and tie on it, calling it defense of the state just to look legitimate on paper.
That is the exact mechanism of the red-blue nexus. Sudan is not experiencing random, chaotic violence. You are watching highly calculated power centers actively fusing red extraction tactics with blue state rhetoric.
Wow.
They want the plunder and the total impunity of a warlord, but they want the legal recognition and the international funding of a legitimate government.
That is incredibly chilling, really. But the presentation doesn't just focus on the men with the guns, right? There is a whole suppressed society trapped underneath all this warlordism.
Thankfully, yes.
Slide 9 shows an illustration pointing out a really stark visual contrast. On the left side of a crack in the earth, you have these ruined, broken bank and radio tower icons. But on the right side, there is a resilient, glowing green chain linking icons for medics, women, youth, local committees, and the diaspora.
This slide contrasts the orange and green levels of the spiral. Orange represents interrupted modernization.
Right, like the city before the war.
Exactly. Think of pre-war Khartoum's massive urban potential. The businesses, the tech sector, universities, banking, that is all paralyzed now by infrastructure collapse and this massive brain drain. But on the right, we see the green level, which is civic solidarity.
Right, and this is where those neighborhood resistance committees come into play. When the government vanished, it was these grassroots networks, local women, and the youth diaspora who stepped in to deliver mutual aid, to secure food, and organize medical evacuations, completely unarmed.
They operate on green logic, which prioritizes human life and communal well-being over any kind of military victory.
Yeah.
But the slide points out their tragic vulnerability. Green networks are utterly defenseless against red armed groups.
Right, because you can't fight a tank with solidarity.
No, you can't. A neighborhood committee cannot negotiate with a tank rolling down their street using mutual aid. They are highly vulnerable to systemic blockades and raw violence.
Which means any real recovery has to be designed at an even higher level to actually protect those civic networks.
Exactly.
Slide 10 shows an illustration describing a complex web of interconnected circles. You have nodes for security, health, food and agriculture, displacement, peace, and state legitimacy. And they all have arrows connecting to each other, wrapping around a central node called system.
To fix a broken system, you need systemic thinking. The presentation labels this yellow and turquoise. Yellow is systemic integration.
Okay, what does that look like in practice?
It means having the capability to see the interconnected crisis. You can't just sign a political piece of paper for a ceasefire. You have to tie that ceasefire directly to economic recovery, control of the agricultural hubs, and decentralized federalism.
Okay, and when we say turquoise ecosystem restoration, honestly, that sounds a bit like a corporate sustainability buzzword. What does that actually mean for someone living in Sudan?
It means literal survival, not just policy.
Oh.
Turquoise logic understands that you cannot have long-term peace in Sudan if you don't manage the water in the Nile Basin. It involves climate-resilient agriculture and integrating cross-border refugees. It is the understanding that human survival is tethered to the physical ecosystem.
Right.
But implementing turquoise solutions requires a level of stability that is nearly impossible when red warlords are still fighting over the water access points.
Right. If you can't even get to the river safely, you can't exactly build a climate-resilient farm.
Exactly.
And this brings us to one of the biggest aha moments in this entire presentation, explaining why international help keeps failing. Slide 11 shows an illustration explaining a map of Sudan overlaid with a table that matches 5 different social zones to their dominant spiral dynamics logic.
This is the massive critical insight of the 2026 analysis.
Yeah.
You cannot measure Sudan with a single national temperature.
The table shows that active war zones are trapped in beige survival and red force, but major cities in the diaspora operate on orange commerce and green civic solidarity. Meanwhile, international humanitarian projects are coming in trying to use green, yellow, and turquoise logic.
This perfectly explains the failure of traditional diplomacy. Just imagine a United Nations envoy with an iPad flying in to speak yellow systemic logic, talking about human rights and decentralized federalism.
Right.
And they are talking to a 19-year-old militia commander operating on purely red warlord logic who only understands territorial control and gold.
Wow, yeah.
They aren't even speaking the same psychological language. Interventions must match the dominant local logic of the specific zone they are targeting, or they will be completely ignored or manipulated.
And here's where it gets really interesting to me. Slide 12 shows an illustration describing a jagged vertical fault line running down the middle of the screen with lightning bolts separating clashing value systems.
Yeah.
You have survival clashing with long-term development, military order sparking against civic governance, centralization fighting federalism. I mean, it's like trying to host a chaotic game night where you're trying to play chess, checkers, and high-stakes poker all on the exact same board at the exact same time.
All right.
Nobody agrees on the rules of reality.
I love that game night analogy because it captures the absolute friction on the ground. When the fundamental rules of reality clash, progress violently stalls. And the presentation forces us to abandon this comforting idea that progress is just a straight line toward democracy.
It's definitely not. And the next chart makes that heartbreak brutally clear. Slide 13 shows an illustration describing a line graph showing a regression wave. It traces Sudan's history, peaking beautifully upward into civic mobilization colored in green. But then, right at the April 2023 mark, the line drops off a terrifying, sheer cliff. It completely flatlines at the bottom into a chaotic scribble labeled raw survival and force in beige and in red.
That drop represents the illusion of linear progress.
Right.
We often assume nations, especially after civic uprisings, slowly but surely march towards stability.
Yeah, that's what we want to believe.
Right. But this graph shatters that illusion. Extreme trauma causes violent regression. The path to recovery now is incredibly daunting because you have to somehow bridge this massive, newly formed chasm between the green civic mobilization that was building before the war and the yellow state integration required to actually run a country.
So, looking at all of this from the vantage point of 2026, where does it go from here? Like, what's the actual path forward?
Well, the deck gives us a few options.
Okay. Slide 14 shows an illustration describing a timeline starting from this 2026 present that splinters outward into 3 distinct branching paths for the future of Sudan.
The authors map out 3 potential trajectories. Scenario 1 is fragmentation. This is a future dominated by beige, purple, and red.
So warlords and survival.
Exactly. It means the permanent expansion of the war economy, deeply entrenched, localized warlordism, total reliance on tribal loyalties, and endless mass displacement. It is a permanent fracture of the society.
That is just a nightmare scenario where the warlords just permanently carve up the map. So what's the second?
Scenario 2 is militarized stabilization. This operates strictly on red and blue logic. It envisions a future where one armed force brutally dominates all the others. Basic order might be restored and raw violence might decrease, but civic political participation is severely crushed under a heavy-handed military dictatorship.
So peace, but at the cost of all freedom.
Exactly.
And the third path, the one that actually builds toward those higher levels of the spiral.
Scenario 3 is civic systemic transformation. This requires green and yellow thinking. It involves a comprehensive ceasefire that actually leads to civilian control, regional decentralization, integrated economic recovery, and crucially, the inclusion of the diaspora in rebuilding the institutions.
Which is incredibly hard to achieve, obviously, but clearly the only sustainable way out of the spiral. And that leads to the final takeaway of the deck. Slide 15 shows an illustration. It features a large, thick arrow mapping a progression, starting at security, moving to trust, then civic institutions, then economic recovery, and finally ending in systemic integration.
Yep.
And this arrow underpins 3 major boxes for political, social, and economic milestones.
Notice the sequence there, though. Security has to come first to build trust. You cannot build civic institutions when people are operating in beige survival mode.
Right, if you're dodging bullets, you aren't voting.
Exactly. The political box demands a civilian transition where armed groups submit to a unified shared law. The social box requires reopening schools, restoring local trust between fractured communities, and protecting minorities.
Mm-hmm.
And the economic box demands transparent management of resources, like the gold mines, alongside agricultural recovery.
The bottom line of the slide is really powerful. The goal isn't just to level up through these colored stages like a video game. The goal is to rebuild the actual physical and social ecosystem where higher order thinking can even survive.
Yeah.
So, taking all these slides into account, what does this all mean for how we view this crisis?
This raises an important, deeply provocative question for the listener to really mull over. If the blue level, the concept of a traditional, centralized nation-state, has completely shattered in Sudan, perhaps the very concept of the traditional nation-state is now obsolete there.
It's obsolete.
Yeah. We've seen how armed groups use the idea of the state merely as a disguise for warlordism.
Wow. So treating Sudan like a broken machine that just needs its pre-2023 government reassembled is not just wrong, it might be actively fueling the violence.
Exactly. To find lasting peace, the international community might have to stop trying to rebuild the past. Instead, they might need to help Sudan pioneer a radically new, highly decentralized model of governance, a model that respects local autonomy while maintaining regional peace, which is something the world, frankly, doesn't even have a perfect template for yet.
Man, it's an incredibly daunting challenge, completely redefining a nation from the ground up like that. But honestly, seeing those green networks, the medics, the youth, the local committees still fighting for their communities in the dark, it proves the resilience is there.
It really does.
Well, thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the fragmented spiral of Sudan. Take care and keep questioning the rules of the board.